Jim Mills here tonight wrote a book describing one of those exceptions on the night of the lockup, and I refer you to that for some incivility, but that was the only era of incivility that I recall. The next person I'd like to ask come up is John Knox. John, John's got a bad leg, so here he comes. Jack was skiing and threw his knee out. Can you get up here? There's a step on the other side. Jack and I were both from Contra Costa County. Jack.
Thank you very much, Jerry. I wouldn't have missed this for anything. I was very fond of Phil, and he was my first seatmate when I first came up in 1961. But first I want to mention that, because I think it's appropriate, that in 1961 when Jess Unruh was serving his first term as Speaker, a number of us were sitting around in the Speaker's office basking in the charm of this large man who was our leader. I'm sure Jerry was there, and was in the afternoon, and we were making our plans and talking about what we were going to do. And there's a knock on the door. And Jess said, you know, that's Phil Burton. He just senses when a meeting's going on. So if you hear a knock on the door, friends, why, somebody go and open it, because I think that Phil is here certainly in spirit, and I'm sure he would be enjoying it. He, as I said, I was his first seatmate. My predecessor, a very conservative Democrat named Judge Masterson, had been his seatmate, and they always said that prior to my arrival that Masterson pushing Burton's voting switch was responsible liberalism. And he asked me, and I was very honored to be a seatmate, but he gave me a lot of instructions. One, I was to stay in the seat because he liked to wander around the floor in various operations. He had all kinds of procedures going on and plans and operations going, as we all know. But in addition to that, I had one other instruction, and that had to do with John O'Connell, his colleague from San Francisco. Phil was already preparing, I'm sure, to run for Congress, and he said, Jack, he says, the one thing, do not let O'Connell be more liberal than I am. So if O'Connell voted no on a bill, I had to switch Burton to no, even though I might be voting aye or whatever. But that was the way he planned it. My favorite stories about Phil, of course, have to do with reapportionment, and I'll just mention one which may be in the book. I haven't had time to read it yet. I just got it this afternoon, John, but I will proceed quickly. And that, of course, was the categories of reapportionment. And Phil, of course, as has been mentioned, knew what everybody's district was like, not only here, but all over the country. But you asked Phil about a given legislator, and he would say, and you've all heard this, he's as safe as in his mother's arms. Then you'd ask about another legislator. Well, he's safe if he works hard. Then you'd ask about a third legislator. He'd say, he's fucked. So it was very important. It was very important to get into the first two categories. I remember Phil, all of his legislative life, starting at least when I started. I knew him before I ran for office. He was always active in Democratic politics. He was the man you talked to. He was always ambitious. He had all kinds of operations going and had votes where you wouldn't expect. He became an expert in the legislative pension system and could pick up conservative votes of longtime legislators anytime he really needed them badly, because he took care of them as part of that. And I remember him so well toward the latter part of his life. Still had the vibrancy, still had the rage, still had the intense desire to get the right things done, still was bitter about those who had really failed him, but never lost his hope for the future, never lost his real desire and his real battle to see that the right things were done. I remember his last election campaign in San Francisco when Milton Marks ran against him. And everybody said, well, Phil may be vulnerable, and everybody was talking about this and that. And Phil didn't get mad at Marx, or he may have been angry with him, but he didn't indicate it. He just said, no, that's fine, it's good for the process. And that, I thought, was a marvelous thing. He was a great man, and I'm just really grateful, John, that you've chronicled his works. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jack. Bob Monaghan. Bob, are you still here? Where's Bob? Yeah, Bob, come on up. Bob was certainly part of the Republican leadership, later became the Speaker of the State Assembly, a Republican Speaker, and I know shared the respect that most of all of us have for Phil. Bob.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you. Thank you. I don't know exactly where the spirit of Phil Burton is tonight, but I hope it's somewhere where he can listen. This would be the first time in his entire existence, any place, that he ever listened to anything. You didn't talk to Phil Burton, you listened to Phil Burton. I'm probably the least likely person to be up here to talk on this occasion because I cannot think of a single thing with which I agreed with Phil Burton. Not one single thing. On the other hand, I have some comments that I'd like to make. John, I haven't read the book yet. I've read one of the big excerpts and one of the smaller excerpts, and I'm sure I'm going to dig into it pretty quick. And I don't know how many mistakes there are in the book, but there's one in the title. There is no such thing as rage when you talk about Phil Burton. It's outrageous. Everything that Phil did was outrageous in one category or another. I got started on the wrong foot with Phil. A lowly freshman legislator, and some bill came along, and all of a sudden Phil had this bill up and he mumbled, as we often did when we didn't want people to pay too much attention to the bill, and it was about to pass, and I was stumbling around looking to see if I could find the bill because I hadn't read it yet. And he had mentioned something like insurance in his report. And I thought, well, I've been in the insurance business. I better check this out. So it was too late. So I didn't have a chance to read it, so I just voted no out of instinct. I said, well, I better vote no. Well, as it was turned out, the big board was all green except this one red vote. So I grabbed the bill, and then I read it, and I found out that Bill, characteristic of him, had this slippery little amendment in the bill that was going to put his old friend George McLean into the insurance business without going through the normal qualification kinds of things. And so obviously the legislature would never pass this, but they knew about it. And so I served notice of reconsideration. Phil came over to me and said, you young punk freshman legislator, well, you can't do anything like that. Take this, you can't serve notice of reconsideration the next day. And I said, well, I think I'm going to do it. That next time he came over, he was pounding on the table, and the next time he was over threatening me, he was bodily going to throw me out because he knew that piece of legislation was doomed if I ever carried through the notice of reconsideration, which I did, and he lost the amendment in this big bill that he wanted. And do you think he was mad at me? Never. He came over to me and said, I want to congratulate you on that. You know, you were sharp enough to pick this up, and I lost, but nevertheless, that was it. Some of us think of a lot of negative things about Phil, but he had a lot of positive qualifications as well as disagreeing on issues. When I went back to Washington, was appointed to the U.S. Department of Transportation and had to be confirmed by the Senate, controlled by the Democrats. You know who it was that went over to the Senate and collared all of the Senate Democrats on the committee to urge them to support me for that position? In spite of our past history of never agreeing upon anything, after I was confirmed and was sworn in, he made the trip down from the Hill down to the Department of Transportation to be there when I was sworn in. John has captured this record very clearly. All the great things that he did, whether you agreed with them or not, they were great legislative marvels. But the same token, here was a man who you had to listen to because you didn't talk to him, and you had to put up with him because he would surround you at any kind of occasion he had. He was there when you needed him. So Phil, I hope you're listening for the first time. Thank you.
Very good, Robert. Charlie Warren began in politics, I guess, under the auspices, in a way, of Phil in San Francisco. Served with him in the legislature and then went back to Washington, D.C. while Phil was in Congress and Charlie was in the executive branch. Charles?
Thank you, Jerry, and thank you, folks, for being here on this rather wonderful occasion. I want to thank or congratulate John Jacobs on the effort that he made in writing this biography, as he indicated, several years, an immense task. And I want to thank him for selecting, as he did, the life of John Burton as for his biography. I thank him because it's going to help me fill in some gaps about which I have wondered for many, many years. I suppose I first met Phil Burton before anybody here other than his brother. It was during the late 40s. I was a student at Berkeley, and I think Phil had graduated from USC and was going to night law school at Golden Gate and working for a Time Oil company. I met him on an occasion when several of us who lived in San Francisco decided that we wanted to become politically active and we wanted to form the California Federation of Young Democrats, and more specifically a San Francisco chapter. So it was in the formation of the Young Democrats of San Francisco that I first met him. And the formative period having passed, it came time to select a chairman, and Phil asked me to place his name in nomination to be the chairman of the San Francisco Young Democrats. I had never given a speech before in my life. As I am now, I was then even more so, which is nervous when addressing an audience. I remember to this day getting up and holding on to the back of a chair, placing Phil's name in nomination to be chairman of the Young Democrats. It was not, for those of you who know Phil, as all of you do, it was not an uncontested election. It was a very spirited election, but one which he won handily. Phil then went on to help form the California Federation of Young Democrats, became Northern California chairman. I succeeded him as chairman of the San Francisco Young Democrats, and succeeded him as Northern California chairman of the YDs, and then we participated in something which was very exciting at the time, which was the formation of the California Democratic Council, which we thought would be the vehicle to bring citizen participation into political debates. As a result of that relationship, Phil asked me to be the chairman of his first political campaign for the Assembly. During the course, it was a primary race, and I think was it Tommy Maloney? John? Huh? Yeah. Cliff Perry. It was a primary race, and I think Phil was still in the military at Camp Parks. Anyway, we conducted this election, during the course of which Phil Berry happened to pass on. And with that, Phil was the only one on the election, and we thought, well, how wonderful, he's made it, he's going to the legislature. Well, as fate would have it, Phil lost that election. So I am the one who managed the only losing campaign for Phil Burton. As a result of that, I suppose that explains in large part why shortly thereafter I left San Francisco and went to Los Angeles. And it was in Los Angeles that I became a member of the legislature and renewed my acquaintanceship and friendship with Philip here in Sacramento. As has been described to you, he was an overpowering, all-consuming, all-embracing human being and personality. And references have been made on several occasions to AB 59. And I suppose it reveals more than I should want revealed of our relationship, because I remember shortly after I arrived here as a freshman member, just a few days or weeks, he came up with a small bill and says, "You'll want to co-author this." And I says, "Well, what is it?" "Never mind, sign. Co-author the bill." I said, "You mind if I look at it?" "No, I don't have time for that to sign." So I did. It was a small bill, later to become this huge AB 59, which revolutionized social welfare in California. And I suppose it's in the book, but the Burton-Veneman relationship. John Veneman, I believe, was assigned, as a result of AB 59, John Veneman was assigned by the Republicans to just follow Phil around to see what he was doing with this bill. So there were only two people who knew anything about it. One was Phil and the other was John. When Phil went to Washington, was Reagan then?
Jack was Undersecretary.
Who brought Jack back? Nixon brought, I truly, to this day, I believe that Nixon brought Veneman to Washington in order to follow Phil Burton around. I do. Veneman owed a lot to Phil. Then Phil, shortly after I was in the legislature, Phil went on to Congress, and I didn't see him too frequently until I went to Washington in the late 70s during the Carter administration. This was after his loss for the majority leader position. I would occasionally go over to Phil's apartment, Phil and Sala's apartment, and right they were adjoining apartments on the Hill where Phil and Sala lived, and one of his colleagues lived right next to him. The colleague happened to be a Democratic member from California, and one whom Phil knew voted against him, in that instinct on which Phil relied so intensely. And there would come a time every evening when the rage would be expressed, not softly, so not to disturb the neighbors, but loudly, so certainly to let Phil's colleague know that he had yet to forgive him. He was truly a political genius. He was an incomparable personality. I must confess, if I was asked who made the strongest impression on me in my lifetime, I would, without hesitation, pick Phil Burton. But as you can tell, there were gaps in the several decades of my knowing Phil. And it is those gaps that I am going to turn to Phil with relish in this book. Those of you who met Phil only sparingly or know of him only by reputation, you will have a great sense of pleasure and enjoyment in what you have as a result of John Jacobs' efforts. And I thank him again and congratulate him, and thank you very much.
Say, Nick Petras. Nick, don't go yet. Senator Petras, come on up here. Nick was with me on that day when we first won our Democratic primaries, and Phil briefed us on the intricacies of California political processes. And Nick's been there longer than any of us and more constantly. And if there's ever a person that reflected Phil's political ideals and philosophy, it's this fellow right here.
Thank you. I'm honored to be included. Thanks. My dear friend and classmate, Jerry Walde. There have been a lot of recitations of great memories of Phil Burton, so I won't try to match The few I heard were terrific. I would just wanted to be here to be identified with this group of admirers of a great person. I will say this, my first meeting of Phil was in San Francisco at some kind of a convention of the Democratic Party, and he was there representing the Young Democrats. And throughout most of the meeting, he was on his feet on every issue, either asking questions or answering them. And pretty soon I learned that if you want to learn the ropes in this party and what's going on in the issues, you got to get a hold of Phil Burton. Someone would ask a question of the chair. Pretty soon everybody in the room would turn and look to Phil and wait for him to get up to answer. So I made it a point to meet him on that day, and ever since was a good friend and admirer. I appreciate the work he did as a great public servant at all levels in which he served. So I'm just here to express that, to identify with him and with all of you who know him. I read in the one of the San Francisco newspapers about this beautiful new statue that's been erected in his memory over in Marin County at the park that he fought so hard to establish, the whole Golden Gate area. It's a huge area that he fought for a long time to accomplish and add to our national park system. And it's only one facet of the many different things he did in his life. He was known for his political, parliamentary expertise and his maneuvering, but he did a lot of other things. He really deserved his reputation on the parliamentary stuff. I remember for many years after he had left the legislature and gone back to the other legislature in Washington, there would be others who tried to follow his footsteps, and they would maneuver this and that, manipulate, and pretty soon they'd fall flat on their faces. And somebody would ask me, what's he trying to do? Well, he's trying to be a Phil Burton, but he can't finesse it. There was a long line of those folks who tried valiantly, but they just couldn't put it together the way Phil did. He was masterful at that. But one thing we don't want to overlook, and I'll close with this, he was great on the issues. That's why I like the title of Mr. Jacobs' book, A Rage for Justice. Phil understood that justice is not something that is dispensed in the local county courthouse alone. That's really the last step. The way Phil saw the world, the House of Justice was in every building that we occupied. It was in our home, it was in the legislature, it was in City Hall, it was everywhere where people live. And he felt that if we understood and practiced justice in our relationships with each other every day, we wouldn't need the courthouse, because disputes wouldn't develop as much as they did, and once they did, they would be resolved in a civil manner and very quickly, and you wouldn't need to go to the courthouse to battle it up. So I commend the author not only for the book, which I look forward to reading, but for his marvelous choice of a title. Thank you very much.
I have just one more formal presenter, and then we'll open the floor up and hope that everyone will participate. But in the meantime, the bar's still open, and don't refrain from enjoying that while we're continuing the program. You know, there's always someone in any community, whether it be a local, a state, or a national community, that has just extraordinary respect, earned respect from what they've done, what they stand for, how they have accomplished their responsibilities. And I can think of no one that I know that enjoys that respect more and that deserves it more than Alan Post, our former legislative analyst. Alan, would you say a few words, please?
Thank you, Jerry, for the kind words. You know, I spent about half my life before Ways and Means Committee, and I'll never forget. There was a bill that Jerry Walde was carrying to increase the benefit payments to members of the teachers' retirement system. And he came before committee and he looked at him and said, "This is just a little bill for dead teachers." And Bud Collier turned and said, "If I ever get in trouble, I'm going to get him for my lawyer." My recollections of Phil Burton are really not many, and there are some pretty good reasons for that. He was not a member of Ways and Means, but as other members, he had to come before them from time to time with legislation. And I remember him coming in, this big fella, eyes bulging and his eyebrows going up and down, and a veritable torrent of words and vitality. And I said to myself, this is a guy I'm going to keep out of the way of, and I pretty well did. He also, as the time went on, became famous for his machinations, and that was another reason that in our office we tried to point out where there were fiscal machinations, but to stay out of political ones. And so for all those reasons, I really didn't know much about Phil Burton. I got to know his brother John far better because he was on Ways and Means, and I became very fond of him. I went back to Washington after Phil Burton did on one occasion. He was extremely gracious to the committee that I went with, which was a legislative and executive committee to look into a problem that we had inherited from the federal government. I was again reminded of the fact that he never sat down. He charged around, he was covering this and that and everything the whole time we were there, but I was impressed to the fact that he was a very important person. And later, during the Reagan welfare reform measures that have been mentioned, and then H.R. 1 for the federal bill and the conformity that was required by the state of California, our office became very much involved. And Tom Dooley, who was here tonight, who was our welfare expert and who really was indispensable to that process, was called by Phil Burton to give some estimates of the cost of the Reagan legislation, and Tom Dooley said, well, Mr. Congressman, our office serves the members of the state legislature, and we really don't respond to congressional requests. We have to have a member of the state legislature that comes in and asks us to perform these services. Phil said, fine, fine. In about 2 minutes, the phone rang. It was Bob Moretti. And Bob says, any call from Phil Burton is a call from Bob Moretti. So from that time on, we were involved. As a matter of fact, he almost took Tom over. Talking about his mastery of details, Tom said, was absolutely incredible. He knew everything about everything that we should have known about, the need for waivers, all of the problems that were being, to some degree, ignored by the Reagan administration, Phil was on top of. And every day, I don't know how often during a day, but it seemed to me like 2 or 3 times a day, the phone would ring and it would be Phil Burton on the line. So we were deeply involved there. I was not personally. Tom kept me filled in, but I never had any direct contact with Phil. Later on, when the federal legislation needed to be adopted by California, the same situation applied. And he took over Tom Dooley. He used him in a very capable way, certainly for the benefit of California. If you think of California as meriting federal funds, he was certainly a good influence of milking the federal budget for the benefit of the citizens of the state of California. So in that respect, I had a lot of admiration for what I knew about Phil Burton, and I'm delighted that this book has been written. I'm delighted that Jim Mills wrote a book that chronicled those days. Now we have the benefit of this book, which I shall read and fill in all the gaps that I have in my own mind. So, John, thank you for writing it, and I'm delighted to hear the remarks of those of the members of the legislature who were closer to him than I am. I'm always mindful of the difficulty of appearing after a group of legislators. They may not be able to get anything enacted, but they sure are entertaining. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. Before I turn the microphone open to the floor, let me just mention 4 of our colleagues that aren't here that would be here. Jess Unruh, John Veneman, Frank Lannerman, and Bob Crown. Just because he and Phil were so much alike in so many ways, different in many ways, but in terms of stature in the political world, that was earned. Both of them were literally unique in that regard. Jack Veneman, because of his, there's no human being I've ever met that was a greater joy to know and that enjoyed life more than Jack Veneman, and there's probably few that understood the matters that Phil was most deeply concerned with, the elderly and the poor, than did Jack. And Bob Crown and his indescribable affinity with Phil, particularly during reapportionment. And finally, Frank Lannerman. Phil used to call him Uncle Frank, that if you wanted something done to benefit children or old people in California, just go to Frank and he would drop everything. And Frank Lannerman would have been here tonight, I'm sure, were he able to do so. Well, with that, I hope there are a number I know in the audience that could make contributions that we'd all be interested in. Please step forward. Cole, John?
I just wanted to add one thing here and set the record straight a little bit. Jack Knox talked about the last congressional election between Phil Burton and Milton Marks, and how Phil, when asked, conceded that it was good for the process. If you will indulge me for a minute, I'd like to read the last paragraph from this chapter on that election. At the election night party, AFL-CIO lobbyist Jay Power, who spent a month working on the campaign, congratulated Burton. "So what are your plans?" Power asked, expecting Burton to talk about a vacation or at least a few days off to recover from the rigors of the campaign. "Jay," Burton said, "my plan for the immediate future is to wipe Milton Marks off the face of the planet." Thank you.
Is Milton in the audience? Guess
He's
not.
at a funeral.
Cole, would you care to say something? Cole Blease, Justice of our appellate court, and former lobbyist for the ACLU.
Philip, to my mind, was, with Thaddeus Stevens, one of the greatest legislators in the history of this country. And it was my great privilege to learn from Phil when I arrived here all that many years ago in 1957. And what impressed me about Phil, from the standpoint of somebody who was interested in good works and didn't know how the hell you would accomplish any of those things in a political setting, that Phil was the answer. Phil knew how it was that you could turn to legislation for the benefit of those people in need. And Phil did this by his incredible mastery of the substance of legislation, coupled with his total mastery of the politics of it. And I used to go around and ask people about, who always are entirely too cynical about the political process, and describe Phil to them as, in effect, a moralist in the political process, an incredibly successful moralist and one of the most successful politicians of all time. But he did that in ways which I think would deter the normal human being, because he worked at it night and day. And one night in the 1960 or thereabouts, I wandered through to the Capitol looking for somebody to have a drink at about 11 o'clock in the evening, and Phil's door was the only one that was open. And Phil was inside, on the floor, cutting out voting records to put in a large scrapbook, and I'm sure he mastered and memorized all of this. And I said, Phil, what the hell are you doing? And he was doing his homework, his night work. I said, well, come on, let's get a drink. So we walked out of there and over toward the hotel and the bar. And he said, I really feel lousy. I said, I don't know what's wrong with me. And he thought about it a few minutes and he said, I know what's wrong with me. I forgot to eat today. This enormous energy directed for, if you agreed with his values, I did completely, directed in this way was a marvelous thing to see. And to try to emulate in some small way those qualities of Phil. I'm not sure everybody would want to buy into the Burton double entry system of bookkeeping, which was never forget a friend or an enemy, and he had an incredible elephant memory. I don't know if everybody would buy into that, but I think that was essential to his political workings. A wonderful and marvelous, inspirational person, and to the end of my days, I remember Phil as one of the greatest of Americans. Thank you.
Cole reminded me that I got a call a couple of days ago from Justice Radigan, who's retired from the Court of Appeals, and Joe Radigan was invited and wanted to attend, but had a personal matter come up. He was unable to. Joe handled, if I recall correctly, AB 59 in the Senate, and gave probably one of the most memorable speeches I heard in either house of the legislature during the years I served there on behalf of poor kids. It was just an extraordinary speech. It's too bad Joe couldn't have been here. Are there any others that desire to say anything? Oh, sure. John, how about you just saying goodnight for everybody and tell them that story that I forget that you recall. Well, I don't care, whatever one. You can think of one while you're walking up there.
Well, yeah, just to say goodnight, but Tom Reese, who was a colleague of Philip's both in the House and the Senate, but before I get to that, I just have to get one more. I mean, Coleman talks about Philip on the floor getting voting records. I remember one Christmas night that Sala, who should be mentioned tonight because Philip without Sala was really like, lox without cream cheese. I mean, they were like, as everybody knows, very, very, very one in everything. And that might have been Sala that said what she was going to do to Milton Marks. But anyway, we had Christmas dinner at my brother Bobby's in-laws' house, and then I drove Phil home. He had an apartment on Pine Street in the city, and come on upstairs, kid. So I had nothing to do for a while. So I went upstairs and sat there and watched him read the social welfare laws of the state of Arkansas. Now, anyone who knows much, which I didn't at the time, doesn't have to be a genius to know why Philip Burton was reading the welfare laws of the state of Arkansas. Can anybody guess? How about try Wilbur Mills, who was the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee of the House, who fell in love with my brother when he showed him how, with a simple amendment, he could get $10 million for the state of Arkansas. And that was on Christmas he was doing that. But just in goodbye, I'd say this. Tom Reese always said, you know, Phil is a very interesting guy, but he usually leaves you in mid-sentence. Yours. Thank you very much and good evening.
Well, thank you all. Don't everybody leave. There's a lot more food and a lot more libations, and please hope. And there are a few more books too. I hope you'll do that. And thank you very much for coming. It's been a very enjoyable evening.